Last week I applied the first part of the Brandon Sanderson writing lectures on plot, which was promise, progress and payoff. And I also completed the first part of the writing challenge, which is to write 35,000 new words during the course duration by writing the first 6,250 words and trying to get the opening written. If you're interested in applying the lessons yourself or in taking part in the writing challenge, I have the 2 videos that came before linked below. But today it's all about the second part of plot, which is mainly outlining and Brandon Sanderson's outlining method. So from what I know, there's a pretty big discussion and also I think an identification element in the writing space when it comes to this. Do you outline or do you discovery write? So this whole debate about pantsers, plotters, architects, gardeners. Personally, I never really got that whole discussion aspect to it. I think it's interesting in terms of seeing other processes and trying out different processes, but I don't really understand why it matters whether you outline or not. And that's also something that Brandon Sanderson mentions here when it comes to his outlining process, which I very much appreciate, is this whole thing of if you like to outline, this is his approach and try it. If you don't like to outline, never mind, just ignore this and carry on doing your thing. So this is very much the premise of what I want to do here, is to take his outlining method and trying it out on my own project to see what elements from it work for me. So for Brandon Sanderson, the question of whether you outline or not is basically the question of, do you want to front load discovery work or do you want to do it during the writing? For him, it's something that he likes to do within the outlining session, where basically he can figure out the plot elements, character stuff, setting stuff in that session or in those sessions, so that basically when he gets to the writing part itself, he can focus on making the writing itself as exciting as he can. What I want to try out here is what he talks about in the lecture, how he has an outline as a template that we can use as a starting point. So if you go to his website, in the About section on writing advice, there is the outline for the Skyward book, which we can use as a Word template. I appreciate this so much because I love it when we actually see the real process and the actual details. And here it's really a completely detailed outline for a finished novel. First off, let's start with how he describes his own outline and basically what it is. He has 3 main sections, which is setting, characters and plot. So for character, what he does is he has this section where basically he lists all the characters and he distinguishes them in main character, side character and minor characters, and then he has an introduction section where basically he talks about who the character is, and then he also has the character arc in that part of the outline where he describes what the character arc should be. Then for setting, he has a bit of a story Bible approach where he has the parts of the setting that are important in that particular story. So here it would be the locations, human society, describing some of the culture stuff. And this is something that we will get back to in the world building part of his lecture series, where he goes more in depth as to what different aspects to consider and use them. And then the part that I want to focus on today is the plot part. And within plot, you have the plot structure, which basically describes what structure he wants to follow. And here he also has already, because it's a finished outline, all the plot beats figured out and in the right order. So the question today when it comes to the outlining is really, how did he get to this point where he has all these plot points figured out within the structure? Like I mentioned last week, when it came to the progress, he talked about how progress is basically his starting point. He figures out the progress first and then from there builds the promise and the payoff. And to do that, he starts with plot archetypes. So the plot archetype definition that Brandon Sanderson here uses is basically that they are story templates. They are the kind of stories that you come across over and over again, where the plot beats are basically the same, but character and setting make it different stories. So think of enemies to lovers, star-crossed lovers, chosen one stories, heist stories, all these kind of stories that happen over and over again, but obviously done in different ways. And what he does is he looks at those plot archetypes as his starting point to figure out what kind of story does he want to tell and what happens in these kind of stories, what are the basic plot beats. So to analyze what is exciting about them, what works about them, and then when he does it himself, what elements does he want to use and what does he want to subvert. And what he does is basically he takes all the plots that he has in his story, so all the different storylines, and figures out what archetype do they follow and then combines them into this new story. In regards to that, the question came up of how many should you have and how much room is there in a novel for them, and his answer was basically the more different storylines you have in a book, obviously the more room you have for different plot archetypes. And in general speaking, if you have a rather shorter novel, the norm would be that you have one archetype for the main plotline, one archetype for a subplot, and you have a character arc happening in there. And the other question was, can you use the same plot archetype for different storylines within the same story? So could you use the enemies to lovers archetype twice for the main story and the subplot? The answer is yes, and it's often done to basically use the subplot, for example, to highlight how it could turn out differently in the main story if the characters only did what the subplot characters do, or in the reverse. So it's very much an element that can help you to illustrate a point more poignantly. And another question that came up the week afterwards was, does he have a list of those plot archetypes, like as a starting point of different types of stories, so that the students could use them as an inspiration point? The answer was sadly no, there isn't a list like that. He also didn't really know any resources who has done that. I looked around a bit, I didn't really find a list like that myself either. I found obviously a lot of archetypes in terms of kind of like listing the archetypes, but I didn't really find a detailed list that gave different archetypes and then listed the plot points and also gives story examples. So that's what I did for myself as a starting point, is to start out with the stories that I myself now want to look at more closely and use those archetypes basically as my starting point. If you go to my blog, website, whatever, and look for the list of plot archetypes, you will find this list with the first archetypes that I could think of, or the ones that I want to use right now. And I broke it down basically into a bit of a summary of what the plot archetype is all about, the plot points, and then story examples that I thought of. If you have more examples for the ones that I already have, or if you have ideas for plot archetypes that are missing, you can let me know and I would add it here and also try to break down the plot points. So this is what he does. He goes and he takes all the plot lines in his story and then he figures out which archetype they fall into. For myself, I want to break it down into the 3 storylines that I have, and for each of them define the archetype. I figured out basically already that I have the following archetypes that I would like to take a closer look at. So one of them is the silent invasion, which is really some alien form or some outerworldly threat starts to quietly take over humans and start to create a new world order. The second one is the zombie apocalypse, then the chosen one, and finally the one that I want to also use is lost in another world. And then when he knows what archetype he wants to use, he goes and picks the most known stories in that archetype or the stories that he likes the best, and he tries to break it down in terms of what are the exact plot beats. I did the same here for the silent invasion, so breaking it down into how the story usually goes based on a lot of the most known stories in that genre. Obviously, it depends a bit on what story you're using. The plot beats can vary somewhat, but it's the most common plot beats are always the same, and you have a feeling for it being the same thing, right? So I broke it down into, you have basically a normal or an idyllic looking world where it seems like this is the ideal community, but something strange is going on, something unsettling. Then the protagonist is usually an outsider or someone who hasn't been affected yet, who is the one to notice that something is off. That starts out as a feeling and grows stronger and stronger until it's confirmed that there is some sort of invasion happening, and then the protagonist has to try to survive and look for allies, while a lot of either they team up or a lot of betrayal happens, or they found allies only to lose them again. So there's a lot of not knowing who they can trust, and then in the final conflict it's basically either they manage to defeat this threat and repel this invasion, or they are taken over themselves. And this story type is the kind of story that often ends ambiguous. So even though the protagonist might have defeated the invaders, there's some hint left that maybe they haven't completely won yet, or maybe there's some of the invaders still left. That's how he does it. Basically breaks it down into those plot beats, and he does that for obviously all the archetypes that he uses. So I did the same here for the zombie apocalypse, the chosen one, and then also the one lost in another world. And then from there, what he did during the class section was very much figure out, so what is the appeal of this archetype, why do people like it, which I guess plays into figuring out what elements to keep, how to play them, and also what you yourself like about this story. For myself, what I like about the Silent Invasion story is that in the beginning you know something is wrong, but you don't really know what is going on, and you also aren't completely sure if the protagonist is right in their perception, or if maybe the protagonist is actually the one who might be paranoid or something like that. So there's this whole mystery aspect to it, with this eerie feeling of being in danger. So I really like that aspect to it. And then when it goes over into, okay, they know that there's definitely something going on, but they can't really trust anyone and ask for help. That's the other part of this story that I really like. And for me, I prefer the ones where they have the ambiguous ending of it not being resolved, or where the character is even completely taken over. Now there's a version of this story where basically the protagonist is taken over right from the beginning, and they are an unwilling participant in the invasion. And that would be, for example, the anime Parasite, the Maxim, is very much this thing where there's a lot of sympathy happening for the invading alien species because it's also part of the protagonist. I like that aspect to the story. But right now I am looking at this more ambiguous and more they are the enemy but we can't see them version of the story. And then the final thing that he talks about, not very explicitly but rather in terms of what he does in the lecture, is he has this heist example, and he basically breaks it down into all those plot beats or the problems that the characters have to overcome. And that's very genre specific because it's a heist. Those are all problems, right? They have to be overcome. It's basically the story part. But I think it's also something that you could do for other archetypes, where looking at each of those plot points, how is that a problem for the protagonist that they have to overcome? And by basically looking at all those plot points as problems, you have the conflict already figured out, each conflict at each point. So for example, if you looked at a seemingly normal or idyllic community as the starting point, then if the character had a problem with that, or what is the problem the character faces, you would almost instinctively arrive at, okay, this character is some sort of outsider who doesn't fully fit in, but maybe wants to fit in, or is someone who just joined this community and because of that can't fit in, which is something that I've read in a lot of these kinds of stories, that it starts with an outsider, or this outsider isn't affected because they are an outsider. So I think that approach could really help in terms of not just figuring out the plot, but even the characters and also what the setting has to be like. And then from here, having figured out the plot archetypes, we go back to outlining and how he now uses it. So his approach to then starting with the outlining is to work backwards, which I was very excited about because I always start backwards with everything that I possibly can, so that seemed very intuitive. But basically what he does, it goes and figures out what is the final scene that I want in this storyline, and then how did we get here? And he was asked what exactly is his brainstorming process when it comes to the outlining, and he didn't really have like a specific technique to figuring out the steps, but rather he thinks about it a lot. He goes to the gym and thinks about it. He focuses very much on this final scene basically, and from there lets it develop so that it starts to become clear, and then he can start to fill in the details. And he does this in combination with the plot archetype, plot beats, and figures out what elements he wants to keep and how to use them. So I guess I want to start with that last approach to basically figure out what elements do I want to keep and what is the final scene that I want to have. So as you can see, I broke it down into the 3 storylines that I have and took 2 plot archetypes for the main story, which is storyline 1, which I want to try to combine. And now what I want to figure out is basically, so here the storyline 1, which is the silent invasion, ends with the detective character, which is the opening character, being taken over by whatever has infected all these other people that went missing. So it's very much in line with the silent invasion ending, and that should be the end point for basically the first half maybe, or at least the first third of the storyline 1, and then from there it can go over into the zombie apocalypse plot archetype. So that is the end point, and the progress itself will be the investigation and figuring out more and more of the details of what is going on. So applying his approach by starting backwards. I want the detective to basically be taken over at the end of his storyline. So it's supposed to be where he has found creatures or one weird creature and figured out that the missing people are due to these creatures, whatever they are. And just as he's about to report, he finds himself unable to, speak, move, and then realizes that he himself is also infected or whatever it is, and he is starting to turn into those creatures. Or he sees other people who have been infected before him turn in front of him while he shows the same signs of infection. And then trying to apply the plot archetype into that would be starting out basically with this whole there's a strange inexplicable thing happening, which is here the people going missing all at once, so it's not something normal anymore, it's definitely weird. Then basically following this whole tries to investigate by himself. This is maybe he gets a hint that there is something weird going on in the neighboring country that is very much closed off or not on friendly terms, and maybe this country is even responsible, kind of like going into this whole conspiracy theory investigation part, where when he tries to follow up, that source is also missing. Because of that, he ends up going into that area that was reported, and when arriving there, to his surprise, finds that there's no one there at all. It's a neighboring country, so it should be shut off. There should be maybe even military or something like that, right? But there's just no one there. And he hasn't gone in himself. He has brought along maybe relatives of other missing people. So then when they are in this area, it's very much now this isolated kind of don't know what is going on, you're on your own. And they come across a strange creature. For some reason, they fight off that creature. Maybe they're the ones attacking the creature. Maybe the creature attacks them. And they manage to survive fighting off that creature, only to get to that point where obviously when he tries to report, other people first turn into the same kind of creature, and then he realizes that the missing people were those creatures. There are more of them, and he himself is also turning into those creatures. So that is basically how I would try to apply what Brandon Sanderson taught when it comes to his outlining approach. And obviously what he talked about is that he does this for every plot separately. He mentions that in his outline, this outline is obviously the finished outline, right? Where he combined all the plots together already and figured out what plot event happens from plot A, plot B, and C all in one scene. But when he starts out, what he does is he separates it into the different plot lines, figures out all the separate plot lines themselves first, and then from there he goes and starts figuring out basically the structure and also when what happens in what chronological order, which is actually something that he talks about he does during the writing. So that is one exercise that I want to come back to probably next week in the writing session to apply that, because this week we have something else that is pretty cool to try out. The next topic is plot structure, and here basically he talks about how you can have different plot structures, can apply different plot structures. He doesn't really clarify if there are specific plot structures that you have to use depending on what writing project you have, what type of story. It sounds more like plot structure is basically a way to organize your story, a starting point to organize your story, and there are classic plot structures that you could use as your starting point. In the lecture itself, he talks a bit more about the hero's journey as one plot structure, as well as the 3-act structure, one variation of it, because there are different ones. But he very much encourages the students to go and look up different plot structures and look at other material that goes in depth, how to apply them, what are the exact beats. So that's what I did basically. I went and researched a bit what are the starting point plot structures that you come across over and over again, which are basically 4 that I found that are mentioned over and over again. Obviously there are many more, but these are the 4 classic ones that seem to come up whenever you do the first basic search in terms of plot structure. So the first one is Freytag's pyramid, which is a 5-part structure. It's developed by a German playwright who basically broke it down into exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and the resolution. The second one is the hero's journey, which is the monomyth structure that was popularized by Joseph Campbell. And here it consists of the hero leaving their ordinary world, going on an adventure, facing trials, achieving a goal, and then returning home. Then the third one is the 3-act structure. As mentioned, there are different types, but generally speaking, they are broken down into 3 parts, which is setup, confrontation, and resolution. And often it involves introducing the conflict or problem, then it has a midpoint reversal, and finally there's the climax. And then the final one that he mentions in the lectures themselves as well is to look at the 7-point story structure. This structure was popularized by Dan Wells and breaks it down into 7 key points. Basically it's hook, plot point 1, pinch point 1, midpoint, pinch point 2, plot turn 2, and then the resolution. And this structure has been designed to keep the story going by having a lot of turning points. Personally, the story structure that I'm going to follow is the hero's journey, partly because I already applied it to my own project. I started out with that one, but also because, like Brandon Sanderson mentions, it's a very good intuitive starting point. It has a lot of very cool turning points that are also vague enough that you can fit a lot of types of story into it. And for me, it's really because I feel a bit overwhelmed with all the plot structures that there are and not really knowing when to use which. I feel this is a good point for me to get started with trying out this one. So in the future, what I want to do is look at the different plot structures there are more in depth and figure out when to use which. Because as I described, for example, with the 7-point story structure, sounds like the kind of structure that you would use if you want to have a very fast turning high conflict story, but not necessarily applicable to all stories, right? And also I read something interesting actually this week in the book Anatomy of Story. He talks about how the 3-act structure is based on really the old theater design, right, where you had to have like 3 acts because you had those 2 breaks in between, and it's not really based on any story thing at all. It's really based on the original setting of how stories were told, right? So that was something that I found really interesting, because obviously it makes sense if you think about it. Why are we still so hyper focused on this structure if we tell our story in a different way? Does it still work in the same way? I'm pretty sure that obviously the 3-act structure does work, but not necessarily obviously for all stories, right? Or not as well for all stories. So that's the question that I want to come back to. So yeah, if that's something that you're also struggling with or are also interested in, stick around. We will get to it. But for now, in terms of plot structures, because he himself encouraged us to go and look at different types and look up the information about it, what I did is I linked the 4 that I found and the best explanations that I found below, that you can use them as a starting point if you're in need of finding out information about them. Alright, so let's talk homework, because there's homework. So what I have to do is to take my outline and apply his outlining method for the other 3 archetypes that I haven't done yet in the same manner. But the more exciting homework is actually something for this week's writing session, which is a discovery plotting method that he mentioned. So he did mention that he himself is obviously an outliner and doesn't really do discovery writing, so that's why he's not an expert on the topic, but he had this cool technique that he shared that he himself was taught, which is yes but, no and. It's basically where you take the protagonist is in a situation, has to make a choice, and you ask yourself, does the protagonist achieve whatever they're doing right now? Yes, but it gets worse because blah blah blah. Or no, and it gets worse because blah blah blah. So it's a way to heighten the conflict and to always keep the conflict going even while you're discovery writing. So that's what we're doing this week in the writing session, applying this method. So yeah, as always, if you also want to apply this and you want to do the writing session, you will find the video here as soon as it is published. And if you want to go directly to the next week's lesson, you will find it here in a week's time.